Okay, hi everybody. So we've just got over 220 people who have joined the webinar. Welcome to you all for joining the webinar on communicating climate change during the COVID-19 crisis. You'll see that everybody is greeting each other in chat. So please feel free to say where you're from and then also follow the link to download the report to go alongside this webinar as well. And I'll now hand you over to Robin to start us off.
Hello everyone, and it's really exciting to see you all joining the call. So many thanks, it's really great to see you all. So I'll just be introducing this webinar now, just to give us an idea of what we're doing. I'm presenting a report that we've been writing on communicating climate change during the coronavirus, what the evidence says. So what we've been doing is looking at the social science of climate change communications, and what it tells us, both from actual communications and engagement on climate change, but also communications in time of disruptions and society and our psychological responses to time of disruption. So just to give a bit of an introduction to who we are, I work for Climate Outreach, which is an organisation, and we focus on the social science of climate change communications. So what we aim to do is to be a bridge between researchers who are interrogating communications and how it can be done effectively, and those who are out there in the field doing the work, and to try and find ways of providing good information and advice from one community to another. I also want to give a shout out to our colleagues at the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST, which is an academic centre which we are a core part of, and it's the hub of social science research in the UK. And academics at CAST have been absolutely core and really amazing in helping us pull this report together. So just to give a bit of a background on our work, we believe at Climate Outreach that there's so much to learn from social science, because it is a science, because there's at least 20 years of research looking at how people engage with information about climate change. And the sort of basics of this is that even though we may know that we may think of ourselves as kind of calm, rational information gathering machines that make incredibly rational decisions, we know that as people, we're strongly influenced when we make decisions by our values, by our community, our sense of identity, the narratives and stories that make sense to us. And it's exploring all those factors that really provides the basis of our work. So just to give a background on the work, particularly that I'll be using to guide this particular piece of research, we've done quite a lot of reports, as you'll see here, all of which are pulling together peer-reviewed literature on communicating climate change at different times and in different situations. And particularly some of the work that we're drawing on, for example, is communicating with communities who have been affected by flooding events in the UK, and how that may be affected when you talk about climate change with those communities. Also evidence which is out there about mainstreaming low carbon lifestyles, and also on engaging the public on climate risks and adaptation. So it's a really broad range of data that we're drawing on in order to think about some of the evidence in this report. But that's not the only evidence that we're thinking about. We're also thinking about the evidence from human responses to previous crises and disruptions. What do we know about how human society responds to period of disruption? What does that mean psychologically, socially, in the short and medium term? And that's what we're using to try and guide the basis of this report. I do think it's really important to give a couple of disclaimers here, to think about where we're at and what we can provide and what we can't. The first disclaimer is that the vast majority of research on climate change communications actually does come from quite a few key, and you might say unrepresentative, countries in Europe, particularly the UK, North America, also Australia. And though that is really the reality of that work, and we're doing all we can to try and find ways of doing research in different parts of the world, but it may be that culturally there are parts of the world to which some of these conclusions do not apply, and any kind of feedback and thoughts from your own experience that you've got on that would, I think, be really interesting. The second disclaimer is that, as we all know, we're in a new situation. We're dealing with a new situation in dealing with the post-COVID-19 world. And this report is really the first attempt to pull together the data that we can find, and we hope be as helpful as possible to guide the decisions that advocates are making. But it is a new situation. And as such, really, we know that we need to be testing messaging, to be looking at how different audiences are responding to this situation, to how society is changing. And that's really the only way that we're going to get sure information about planning for the future. So I think that disclaimer is really important, and the idea that we need to be testing messages with different audiences is also really cool. So where are we going? Well, in this report, we've started from the assumption that as human societies, we may be facing a sustained period of disruption. It seems we could be facing not just a health crisis, but around the world, social crises, certainly economic crises, even food crises, and that these may ebb and flow over the next months and years. And it may be that we're in for a very unpredictable period as human society. And of course, that means that as climate advocates, we are still in a position where we are strongly aware of the need to be fighting for climate action and the urgency to take action within the next few years. That has in no way changed, but the situation has become more complicated and more dynamic. And there are interesting changes going on. On the one hand, we can see potentially a policy process that's being delayed. People who are citizens who are understandably and rightly focused on an immediate crisis and therefore less able to engage with climate change, lives which are extremely disrupted. But we've also seen that in some ways, some learnings have emerged from the COVID-19 crisis, and there's to some extent been a moment of reflection in society, and that has in some ways raising opportunities. So it's a sort of complicated and dynamic situation, and what we know is that these dynamics are going to be unpredictable over the next months. So that's the starting point that we're coming from. I think it's quite interesting to start by thinking a sort of brief comparison between the two different crises that we're talking about, COVID-19 and climate change. In some ways, I don't know about you, but to me sometimes it feels, COVID-19 almost feels like climate change speeded up. We see politicians, decision makers juggling a complicated set of economic, scientific, moral factors in a crisis which is fed by complex scientific information where the science doesn't necessarily always give you the answers. Factors of equity, economics, the role of public institutions are all playing their role in the decisions that are having to be made in both these factors. But then of course we can see the differences, and one core difference of course is timescale, and what the comparison between the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis has brought to the fore so starkly is how much better we are as humans at dealing with short-term crises that are put in front of us rapidly. And also that the flow of effect, of cause and effect in COVID-19 is much more obvious to human society, and therefore what we've seen as a profound change to lifestyles, in a way the kind of profound change of a different sort, but profound changes that have been called for in response to the climate crisis, but that we haven't quite been able to achieve. So I think the comparison is interesting, and it shows the way that societies have to change and have to make decisions in the short and long term. So I'm going to move into a series of recommendations now. What we've done is we've looked, as I said, at this broad, rich basis of evidence, and looked through for various different themes that come out of that. And what I'm going to go through for each theme, I'm going to look at the evidence base and then come out with a series of recommendations that emerge from that work. So the first theme that I'm looking at is timing, audience, and messenger. And you might say in some ways this is kind of the basics of communicating during a crisis. The image that I'm showing you now is an image from the Guardian newspaper, which I have to admit I think was changed quite quickly. But for me, the picture here and the kind of accidental implication perhaps that emissions as a result of COVID-19 were something to be celebrated kind of illustrates, in a sense, the really core message of communicating during a crisis, which is that timing is so important and sensitivity is so important. And what we've seen from other crises is that if we try and communicate about climate change And it looks a little bit like climate campaigners are celebrating a situation in which people are losing their jobs and they're suffering, or when people are just dealing with too much trauma to think about what they're talking about. There can be real pitfalls in trying to communicate about climate change during a different sorts of crisis. And I think this letter that I'm illustrating here kind of really shows what happens when it starts to go wrong. It's a letter from a local paper in the UK in March, in which somebody is responding to a climate activist talking about the reductions in emissions as a result of COVID-19 and saying his comments demonstrate perfectly why many of us have difficulty with climate activists. He does not express one word of sympathy for the victims of coronavirus and their families. Instead, he seems to be reveling in it. And I think this is what shows what can start to go wrong if it looks like climate change campaigners are being insensitive to the real suffering and struggling that people are going through. And we've seen these lessons from different sorts of crises. The same lessons have emerged. So some of the work, for example, where we've looked at flooding affected communities in the UK, you do see that these moments of disruption and change in people's lives do challenge established habits and do open up new conversations. And what we've seen, for example, in these communities is that people who are affected by flooding, at least temporarily afterwards, their awareness and concern about climate change does go up. But at the same time, even as the obvious reflection that shows, communicating during the time of the flooding, during the time of trauma, can be really problematic and can seem really insensitive to those who are going through that. Communications have to be sensitive to the needs of the audience, or they're going to backfire. And I think that also shows that, and I think we've seen this very clearly with COVID-19, that people in different situations are going to be different audiences, are going to be going through different experiences. So where one audience might be going through a kind of period of reflection where they're able to think about what they've gone through and they're able to reflect on it and draw some lessons from it. Others are in a real period of disruption and crisis and are not at all able to deal with that reflection and are going to react to it very negatively. So you've got to remember that communications are going to go to more than one audience and think about how everybody is going to respond. Also, just to add a further complication, what we saw from the flooding data in the UK is communities that have gone through trauma also have a right to recover from that and a right to think about what the future is going to look like. So again, that can affect their response to messaging about climate change. Messaging telling them that the same thing, for example, is going to happen again can be rejected because of that factor, because they don't really want to hear it when they're trying to recover. Also, another core part of this work and core to work on climate communications is the importance of the trusted messenger, of a messenger that people see as authentic, like them, somebody who understands their needs and values of their community. And what we've seen from all the work that climate outreach has done over the years is that's often not environmentalists. People often feel that environmentalists don't share their identity, don't share their political affiliations, are people who are other to them. So therefore, environmentalists making comments on trauma and crisis that they're going through, again, could have really negative reactions. So it's always really important to think about who is the trusted and important messenger that people are going to trust. And one example is that we know that scientists and health professionals already are amongst some of the trusted voices on climate change. And of course, that scientists and health professionals that have really come to the fore as the most trusted voices on COVID-19. And therefore, during the COVID-19 crisis, those messengers speak the words that come from scientists and health professionals. They may well be seen as very trusted messengers across a range of different issues. So to draw those lessons together on timing, audience, and messenger, it's really important to get the timing right, to think about what different people, different audiences are going through at a certain time, and therefore what their capacity is to respond to wider messages and to respond to the needs of particular audiences, because different audiences will be in different positions, and getting that messenger right. All of those factors are so important to effective communications. I'm going to go on to the second set of issues that I've been thinking about, which is climate concern. What's going to happen to levels of climate concern over the next months and years, as far as we know, and how might advocates respond to that? So as many of you, I'm sure, will know, climate concern around the world has been going up for the last few years, and particularly in some of the countries where it's most closely tracked, like the UK and North America, it reached record highs in 2019, both as people experienced climate impacts and also as high-profile protests rose to the surface of society. What we're seeing at the moment is that in the public concern about climate change does seem to be holding, as far as we can tell, from a series of kind of snap polls that have been taken over the last couple of months. And this question that I'm putting here, in the long term, climate change is as serious as COVID-19. As you can see, there's very high responses to people agreeing with that around the world. So far, from what we can see from the data that's there, it seems the high level of concern on climate change is holding during the COVID-19 crisis. However, a kind of warning from history, I suppose, that we shouldn't be complacent, is in the past, high levels of concern about climate change have gone down. And this graph I'm showing you is it's from UK, but it shows the falling level of concern from the mid-2000s, then a steeper fall in the late 2000s in the level of concern about climate change in the UK. And this pattern we did see reflected around the world, and particularly in developed countries, this kind of steep fall in the late 2010s. And the reasons for this fall, the fall in analysis seems to suggest that a fall in concern in the late 2000s was probably, up to the mid 2000s, from 2000s to the late, it's probably as a result of some factors like increased political polarization. But then in the late 2000s, there is a lot of things going on. For example, the failure of the Copenhagen conference and the activities of climate skeptics. But analysis indicates that steep fall at that time was probably primarily a result of economic insecurity and lack of media and political attention being paid to the issue of climate change. And this is consistent with what you call the finite pool of worry theory, the theory that essentially people, if they're worrying about quite a lot of things, they're going to have to push some things out, that we have a sort of a limited capacity for worry. So if people start, for example, to really worry about their economic security, the likelihood is they might have to sort of push out concerns on other issues. There's no, as I say, no evidence yet of that coming into play in the situation we're in right now, but we are of course potentially on the verge of serious economic issues in different parts of the world. So it's possible that we might be entering into a time when this is going to come into play. We are already also seeing, and you can see that from this quick screenshot on the left of this slide, that media coverage has fallen dramatically. So it seems quite likely there's potential that the factors are in play that could well cause climate change concern to go down. But again, just to complicate the situation, there are a lot of different dynamics at play at the moment. And as many of us will be aware, various conversations that have risen up during the COVID-19 crisis, fragility of society, vulnerability of food systems, absence of pollution, recovering nature, etc. A lot of different conversations have started to surface in our societies in different parts of the world as a result of the kind of lockdown process that we've gone through. My own experience of that is reflected in this picture of some flowers which I took, and that having had a chance to, from my own experience, engage more in nature. Also, what we're seeing is there's some evidence which suggests that experiencing one dread risk, for example, like a pandemic, one existential threat, could heighten sensitivity to another, climate change. In other words, people going through one extreme risk then become more aware of the possibilities of another. So because of these dynamics which are rising up, these different conversations, potentially people's differing responses to risk, it's possible that the sort of crash in climate concern isn't going to happen because of the different dynamics that are going on. Again, so tracking what's going to happen over the next month and years, because of how complicated this situation is going to be really important. So to summarise, climate concern may go down, and I would say I think it's fairly likely given what we're facing in terms of the economic situation. Our suggestion, therefore, is that there's no evidence means we should stop talking about climate change. It's already embedded in a lot of people's understanding. We're in a moment of going through climate impacts. I don't believe that the evidence suggests that we should stop talking about climate change in the same way, but we may find that people's responses change. For example, as a suggestion, a sort of climate emergency framing may become less salient, but alternatively, messages about fragility might become more so. So the one response to this should be to test messaging on different audiences and again, track that climate polling as it goes onwards. So the third section I'm going to go into is thinking about changing lifestyles. And of course, COVID-19 has seen, if temporarily, people profoundly changing the way that they're living on a very short time scale. And this is quite an interesting moment to go through it in our lives. We do know that a lot of human behaviour, more than 90%, is habitual. So the things we do on a day-to-day level are often very hard. Even if we have the best will in the world, it's hard for us to change our behaviours on our habits because they're sort of done unconsciously. They're just habits. And what we see is that a moment of change, and the evidence base shows that a moment of change can destabilize when you destabilize habits. For example, having a baby, moving house, political, social disruption, etc. Those moments of change are moments where people are more open to thinking about different sorts of lifestyles because things are kind of up in the air anyway. And of course, that's the kind of thing that we've gone through over the last few weeks. And the evidence is it's quite a wide range in the evidence, but the evidence does suggest that new habits take about 10 weeks to form, which perhaps is around about the length of the crisis that we've experienced so far. So perhaps that might give us more optimism that some habits that are embedded, if they are good for health and well-being and also good for climate change, as a possibility that they could be embedded longer term. But again, I think it's more likely, and that's what we mostly see in response to crises, is that behaviours will probably rebound quite quickly back to where they were before. And for example, in the sort of short-term crisis, for example, like a blackout, what you usually see is that people's behaviours change quite quickly, but then they rebound quite quickly to where they were before. This isn't actually universal. So I think one interesting example, for example, is in the wake of the Fukushima crisis, when a nuclear power station in Japan caused a massive reduction in energy supply, in the Japanese government embedded energy efficiency policy measures in the longer term in the wake of that happening in order to reduce people's energy consumption. And that was quite high profile and quite effective. So in other words, government can pick up these kind of lifestyle changes that are occurring and take active measures in order to embed them in the longer term. What we also see is that how important it is, if behaviours are going to change in any way, is the role of peers, the people around us, what we see them doing, and social norms in guiding people's behaviour. And that's really fundamental. So we know that people's behaviour changes when social norms shift, when those people understand the reasons why they're changing their behaviour, when those reasons resonate with their concerns, and they personally have the capacity and the ability to make change. So I think if we're thinking about whether behaviour can be embedded in the longer term, then both the role of government and also the role that people see, the people, the peers they're playing around and the social norms that they're existing within, if that all came to play, then it might make it more likely that lifestyle change would be embedded in the longer term. And just to give an example, apologies for a slightly complicated graph, but or image, I find it quite an interesting one. I think our governments perhaps would hope at the moment and prefer it if the deficit model, as illustrated on the left of the slide, where experts provide societies with information who then act on it, was the reality. But of course, we know that really it's the dialogue model on the right that's the reality that we're living within. When society contributes to social change and social intelligence, that social change is fed back to governments, governments feed down to experts. In other words, there's a complex process of interaction between different parts of society, and it's that interaction that guides any long-term social change, not just a kind of one-way instruction coming from government. So one piece of advice, what does this might mean for us as advocates, is we did some work last year on looking at people's having one-to-one conversations about climate change. So how to have an effective conversation with somebody in real life about climate change. And that work is called Talking Climate, and we've got a report on that. And what came out really crucially out of that is the importance of connection in that two-way exchange. So as many of us will know, I think conversations about climate change sometimes start to feel like a little bit of a fact war, where you're both kind of exchanging facts and trying to win. And what we see is that in that scenario, focusing on forming a strong connection with each other, empathizing with each other, listening to each other, finding points where you have in common is a much more effective way of engaging with each other. And I would suggest, in the kind of situation we're in right now, in a crisis where there's quite a lot of reflection going on in society, that it would be important for advocates to find ways of kind of opening up that two-way exchange. So it looks more like a dialogue, more like opening up a pathway for exchange, and less like a kind of one-way flow of information. One core factor as well that I think is really important in thinking about lifestyle is that we do know from looking at the data around the world that people engaging in what you might call green behaviours, pro-environmental behaviours, do generally report higher well-being. And that is irrespective of income. So it's not something which is caused by people having higher income. It's generally that those behaviours do cause people to have higher well-being. So I feel like that's quite an important factor as well in discussing these kind of lifestyle questions. So just to summarise what we're saying about changing lifestyles, we suggest that opening up conversations in society about what lifestyle changes that we've been forced to go through over the last few months. Are there any lifestyle changes in that experience that have been beneficial for health, for quality of life, for climate change, for opening up that conversation? And then also seeking the policy mechanisms and the social consent to embed those changes. And that goes back to the importance and primacy of going back to government and the role of the Japanese government in embedding changes in the longer term. And I'm a bit optimistic, for example, that we might be seeing some of this happening in the UK with embedding measures towards cycling. So these kind of temporary changes become more embedded in our policy and in our society. I'm now going to move on to talking about efficacy. So what is efficacy? Efficacy is the belief that it's possible to do something, and doing something will make a difference to the problem at hand. And what the social science evidence base on climate change just shows us is that efficacy is a crucial part of motivating action on climate change. Essentially, if we present people with very frightening, very overwhelming information about climate change, and they don't have a sense of efficacy, they don't have a sense that they can do anything about it, it's much more likely that that lack of efficacy will make people feel defensive and want to kind of push the information away. If they feel a sense of efficacy, then they're much more likely to engage with it. That's a really core part of the literature around how to motivate people into low carbon behaviours. I think we're now in an interesting situation in the COVID-19 crisis, which has obviously affected advocates' ability perhaps to protest, so the practical ability to go onto the streets, for example, to protest, and also this effect that's known as the rally round the flag effect, which is that trust in government during periods of crisis tends to go up because people have more invested in kind of trusting in their leaders, if only in the short term. So the combination, I would suggest, of these kind of restrictions of protests and the rally round the flag effect could, and therefore has the potential to reduce the efficacy of people who are engaging on climate change. However, there is a kind of interesting flip side to this, which is the concept of collective efficacy. And COVID-19, I think, has really highlighted in real life that people are willing to change their lives in response to a large scale threat. So, for example, taking action together for a larger purpose. So to take one example, putting on a mask isn't necessarily going to benefit the individual that's wearing the mask, but it's understood that it might benefit other people, that it might benefit society as a wider whole. And that becomes embedded in society, that people understand that that's why they're doing something, and doing it for that larger purpose. There's an interesting analogy here to climate change, where it's often not clear in the discussion around climate change communications, this link between individual action and wider systemic change. So sometimes they seem to have sort of individual action over on one side of the scale and systemic change on the other side of the scale, and they're seen as two completely separate things. Whereas I've been talking about earlier, it's the action of the individual, how they affect their peers, how that affects social norms, ultimately how that affects a government sense that they have social consent to take action is a really crucial part of government's ability to take action in the longer term. So what COVID-19 has shown us in practice is that people are willing to take action together for that larger purpose. And I think that's quite a powerful concept that can be used in climate advocacy. So just to summarise what I've been saying about advocacy, we suggest efficacy means that it's really important to find tangible things, to give people tangible things to do. And finding in a situation where protest and campaigning may be restricted by the practicalities of the situation we're dealing with, finding creative ways of doing it differently. And I would suggest that it also increases the pressure on climate advocates to collaborate and create collective narratives that can hold together, that people can buy into, that increases their sense of efficacy in a sort of increasingly complicated world, because it's so important that people do have that sense that there's something that they can do together. But also building on this sense of collective efficacy, highlighting that individual change is a part of systemic change, as that's something, as we've seen, illustrated really powerfully by the realities of the COVID-19 situation. I'm now going to move on to talking about speaking to values, which is a really crucial part of climate change communications. Just to sort of look at the basics of this, values, the things that matter to us in our lives, kindness, beauty, friendship, success, for example, are really core to people's identity. And what we can see from all the research over the years is that effective communication doesn't happen from the numbers down, from giving people technical facts and figures, but from the values up, but from working out what their values are and speaking to those values. And just to give an example of this, this is some work that Climate Outreach did a few years ago on looking at the values of people who hold a centre-right political perspective. And some of the values which emerged from the work that we did were integrity and authenticity, a sense of responsibility, keeping things in balance, the need for security. So these values were all found to be core to people who hold this particular political perspective. And understanding those values means that you know your audience better and that you can speak to them more effectively. Linked into this work, there's also done some work on resilience, on responding to adaptation and on climate change. And what we see is that in a crisis like the one we're going through, and I'm sure we're all experiencing this, is there's often a strong drive to get back to normal, to get back to the world of security that we know and understand. But we know that on COVID-19 and indeed on climate change, that may well be not possible. It may well be not advisable, even if it is possible. So an alternative framing, which is really powerful, which speaks to different political perspectives, is resilience and preparedness. And we've got that broken down a little bit of what that might mean in this slide here. So for example, the idea of necessity, knowledge of knowing what's happening, the need to adapt to that, pragmatism, preparedness, understanding that there is a problem and thinking about how you're going to adapt to that. The idea of maintaining continuity. And this doesn't mean, particularly in a crisis where it's incredibly difficult, that we keep things exactly the same, but understanding that there's a thread of continuity from the past to the future and making planned changes that are going to deal with the future. The idea of restoring balance, this was an incredibly powerful value for that centre-right work, and I think speaks quite very strongly to the experience we're going through at the moment, the idea that we're out of sync with nature and restoring balance to the world. That's a really powerful frame. And finally, maintaining a good life. It's obviously extremely important for the conversations we're having right now, well-being and protecting our health. So these are all really strong framings and narratives that are likely to resonate with people. Also, another set of values that have really come up from the COVID-19 crisis, the idea of communal values, sort of intrinsic, otherwise known as intrinsic values, the values that sort of come from within rather than coming from other people. Examples might, for example, include compassion and altruism. And interestingly, what the research shows is that many people assume that they hold communal values, but other people don't. But we also know that holding communal values is a predictor. People who hold those values strongly, that's a predictor of pro-environmental behaviour. People who are going to take action on environmental issues tend to hold those values strongly, and it's a stronger predictor than income. We also see that crises will often bring those values to the fore. They bring altruistic, community-orientated behaviour to the fore, where people suddenly support each other. And I think an academic that I spoke to in this context said what she expected would happen is exactly what we have seen happen in the COVID-19 crisis. We have seen communities bond together, respond, supporting each other in ways that they weren't doing before. And this is quite common in responses to crises. And interestingly, this kind of altruism is contagious. So if we see our leaders acting in that way, acting in an altruistic way, people across society tend to start behaving in that same way themselves. It's also, in a crisis, kind of stress relieving, because it's working to support others is a way of regaining control over an unpredictable situation, and it bonds communities together. So it's a natural human behaviour to do this in response to a sudden crisis. And of course, it brings those communal values, which are the predictor of pro-environmental behaviour, to the fore. However, I'm not trying to create any assumptions that this is a completely beautiful situation, because obviously we can see also what happens with crises is that pre-existing tensions and fault lines in society and vulnerabilities in society are exacerbated by a crisis. So one example is the Spanish flu pandemic about a century ago, where society got to a point where people started to be shot for not wearing masks. And a few weeks ago, we saw the UN Secretary General label saying the pandemic is releasing a tsunami of hate. So it seems to me quite likely that the kind of more authoritarian narratives, countries starting to put up more barriers against each other, it's going to be a very powerful narrative in 2020. So you might say there's these two kind of potential threads in society emerging from natural responses to the crisis. This quote I really like from Cristiana Figueres, saying the coronavirus tragedy has also shown that we're only as safe as the most vulnerable amongst us. And I do really feel like just as crises exacerbate pre-existing tensions, they also bring to the fore pre-existing social vulnerabilities. And society, in the context of COVID-19, has had to focus more attention on protecting the vulnerable. And it's made those inequities across our societies more obvious. And that, again, as we all know, is really core to the conversation about climate change. One interesting factor on this is that the concept of fairness is a powerful concept across the political spectrum. So an alternative word you might use is justice, and that is a much more polarizing word. It tends to appeal to people from the left, but it's less attractive to people from the right. But fairness is a concept that really resonates across the political spectrum. So perhaps talking about these inequities that have come to the fore as a result of COVID-19 would be a powerful way of reflecting on that in the concept of fairness. So just to summarize this again, we suggest that a strong framing around preparation, resilience and support is likely to speak to a variety of people in the crisis that we're in. We also suggest that fairness is a really powerful concept that people respond to. And also finally, that messages that focus on those communal values are going to speak to a pre-existing dynamic in society, and perhaps are really even more important because they will oppose the more divisive narratives that we're very likely to see rising up. Just to move into my final section, which is about climate imagery during the COVID-19 crisis. So at Climate Outreach, we did some work in the past on climate visuals, how we can effectively communicate climate change through visual medium. And just to take a step back here, thinking about what COVID-19 sort of visual story has looked like and why, as many of you I'm sure will be aware, there was a kind of really powerful story of kind of the imagery of empty streets, lack of pollution, clean canals. And this is something that kind of went viral on social media and became part of the narrative and story of COVID-19, at least potentially in the early days. But there's been some interesting commentary. This New York Times article is worth a look, which arguing that COVID-19 has yielded little powerful photography because it's a problem that is distant from everyday experience. In other words, the tragic deaths that society is experiencing are happening in somewhere in a place that is difficult to visualize. We don't have powerful imagery. And if you can think of an analogy, for example, if we were losing this many people in another way, the imagery might be much more stark and heartfelt than what we're actually experiencing at the moment. And I do think that's quite an interesting analogy there to climate change. Again, when you have this overwhelming existential threat, but actually can be quite difficult to visualize, can be quite difficult to engage with on an emotional and visual level in that way. So what advice would we draw upon? Again, drawing on the climate visuals principles that I was talking about just a moment ago, we suggest that telling new stories is a really important piece of advice on climate visuals. So rather than the kind of familiar imagery, polar bear, smokestacks, etc., that everybody's melting ice that everybody's seen 100 times, find ways of telling new stories through the visual medium. And also, crucially, showing real people authentic everyday images. In the research that Climate Outreach did on climate visuals, what we really saw is that inauthenticity, kind of posed photographs, particularly posed photographs of politicians, were particularly disliked by the focus groups that were run. And I would suggest that in a crisis where the leaders can be successful by showing compassion and showing empathy, by showing their own realness, essentially, it's even more important that imagery focuses on showing real people, authentic, everyday images. And also taking care with protest imagery. This emerged from the first climate visuals research that we did. But again, this question of people feeling a strong sense that environmentalists don't share their identity has then led to quite negative reactions to protest imagery. And I think that may well have changed with the powerful protest imagery that we saw rising up last year, but we could potentially find ourselves back in a situation where we should really take care with images of protest, with people have again this kind of rally round the flag effect of feeling like more affiliation with government, less patience with protest. They may be more negative towards protest imagery. So just to summarise that, we suggest that images should show real people doing real things and responding to the crisis together. Again, this feeds back into this idea of communal values, people collaborating together in a greater good. We also suggest that to take care with protest imagery, particularly if protest becomes less acceptable. We suggest that climate imagery should tell human stories and not sort of fall back on the old cliches, and perhaps also highlight the fragility of society. Again, this idea of people's response to one dread risk, making them more aware of another. There might be a greater awareness of society of its fragility. And of course, demonstrating the health impacts of climate change. Just to put one little coda on that might be worth mentioning. The evidence does actually suggest that there's quite a low awareness of people's understanding of the link between health and climate change. So while this is a powerful part of the story, don't assume that people are necessarily gonna make that link. So I think that it gets to the end of the presentation, and we've now got 15 minutes to take any questions.
Robin. So we've got a few questions into the Q&A as well. So while people are getting their questions prepared, I can start you off with some that have just come through. So the first one that we have is from Dwight. You stated that scientists and health professionals are among the most trusted messengers, but this can vary. In the US, there seems to be a strong narrative of mistrust in scientists and health professionals. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a really interesting thread that we see playing out in the States. And to me, this question of crises exacerbating pre-existing tensions in society, clearly there were quite significant pre-existing tensions in North American society and sort of polarization between different political perspectives that the crisis of COVID-19 has exacerbated and created this kind of a dualization of the conversation. Something that feels quite interesting is how different it feels, particularly in the UK, where that polarization doesn't exist, and there's a much stronger universal response to the lockdown. So it really shows kind of importance of understanding the pre-existing dynamics within that society. So yes, I think it's a really good point, and I wouldn't argue with you. I mean, it's, again, you have to think about which audience you're speaking to, because that that increased faith in scientists and professionals may well be going on in the sort of the other part of the polarized society, but there is also a strong dynamic against it. So it's trying to, when you're doing messaging, working out who that messaging is going to land with and who's going to experience it.
Thanks, Robin. And just to remind everyone to post the questions into the Q&A box instead of chat, so we can make sure we capture them. But something that comes through on chat, Robin, is to enter slideshow so they can see more of you.
Oh.
So next question then, while you're doing that, is how will climate outreach be tracking feelings on climate change and the complicated dynamics around climate change and COVID? How will they be presented? i.e. how will those messages be tested?
So we are at the beginning of a number of projects and academic partnerships where we'll be digging into looking at how this is going to work in the longer term. These are projects that are just being developed right now, but essentially the plan is to try and find ways of doing exactly what you say, of undertaking research and projects which will undertake focus groups, or we call them narrative workshops, values-based focus groups with different communities, with polling across different parts of the world. And this is projects that we're in the process of starting up, and that's partly, we've been trying to do so because we do recognise the importance of doing that in the longer term, because in such a sort of dynamic situation, you can absorb the information as much as you possibly can and make as many assumptions as you possibly can. But that message testing, that process, both the polling and the focus groups, is really needed to pull that together. So I can't give you a definite answer to that, only that these projects are in process and are being prepared.
Great. And next question from Sarah. It has been suggested that coronavirus emerged as a result of damage to nature, including climate change. Is there any mileage in pursuing that link?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, for me, I think this comes back to the sort of point that I raised earlier in the talk about developing a dialogue rather than a kind of one-way conversation. So seeing what conversations actually are rising up in society and responding to them. And I do think that there is some mileage in the sense that conversation has started to happen. So investigating it and exploring it in social context, it makes sense. I think sometimes trying to pick up these links, if they feel tenuous, or again, if they feel insensitive, where people are actually deep in the weeds of actually experiencing the crisis, can be not such a good idea. But if it's actually rising up in society, then I think, and also particularly because there does seem to be quite powerful conversations rising up, not just about climate change, but about people's engagement with nature, about the fragility of the ecosystems that support us. And that dynamic that you talked about just now is kind of a part of that narrative. So to me, it seems valuable in that context.
And Jamie asked, is there any research being done on behaviour change in places like New Zealand, where government intervention seems to be higher than other countries? So for example, in New Zealand, they have the 4-day week, emphasis on local tourism.
I think my answer to that is not that I'm aware of, but it sounds like a good idea. Like you, I've probably seen many of the conversations that have happened exploring the New Zealand's leadership's response to coronavirus and the extent to which that has become sort of really embedded in that society, and that conversation has successfully happened across society. There's certainly the leadership of New Zealand does reflect many of the instructions on how to do good leadership during a crisis. So she, for example, showing empathy, showing real response to the suffering that people are going through, really taking people step by step, providing clarity. All of those conversations appear to be happening as an outsider very effectively in New Zealand, and we're seeing some kind of interesting analyses of different sorts of leadership. And of course, government communications on climate change, our governments finding ways of communicating with their societies about how to effectively change people's behaviour needs to be a really important part of the climate story, and perhaps is a part of the climate story that is often sort of abandoned, and we focus more on thinking about, for example, the media's communications on climate change. So this is I think it's a really important question to explore, and perhaps looking at how behaviours changed in New Zealand as opposed to how they've changed in other parts of the world could give really tangible examples of what good and effective communications can mean for society and for these processes of changing social norms. That would be my hypothesis. Of course, without having done the testing, I don't know. But.
How do we push back against authoritarian narratives that are bound to be pushed?
Yes, a good question, to which I don't have a magic answer. I think for me, the argument around the concept of people collaborating together in response to a crisis, and the fact that that brings forward this part of human society, brings forward our communal values, is a really powerful part of that conversation. Came through really powerfully, and I was really interested to see what a core part of essentially human psychology it actually is. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that that's what's happening. That is what we do as people. We do collaborate and work with each other, and I feel like that is something perhaps that we sometimes shy away from in the climate movement, perhaps wishing to speak to kind of rational cost-benefit analysis kind of conversation that sits with policy debates, but actually what we've seen happening in the COVID-19 is actually an upwelling of change of strongly expressed values across society, with people collaborating with each other. And the only answer I've got to sort of how we resist these authoritarian narratives is, to me, that is a really powerful counter narrative, something which is current in our society that we can speak to, which is really directly opposed to those authoritarian narratives. And of course, we're in a complicated, fragmented communications environment, and there's a limited sometimes amount to what we can do, but that feels to me like the right way to do it. And again, perhaps it puts more pressure on advocates and on civil society to collaborate with each other in doing that as effectively as possible.
From Joel, so you didn't mention that current campaigns, Just Recovery, Green New Deal, Build Back Better. Do you think that these are good ways to bring climate into the COVID debate?
Yes, I mean, that was partly deliberate, actually, because I guess I sort of wanted to bring something new to the conversation rather than kind of critiquing what we're doing at the moment. I must say I like the concept of Build Back Better on an instinctive level. Again, I think it needs testing, but because it speaks to that kind of preparation frame, that idea of preparation and resilience, it seems to really work in that context. And again, on just transition, as I referred to quite briefly in the presentation, that there are vulnerabilities and inequities in our society that are perhaps being brought to the fore more powerfully by the experience of COVID-19, and we're seeing those inequities both within our societies and across different societies sort of being presented to us slightly more starkly than perhaps they have been done before. And that speaks so powerfully to the just transition narrative, to affected communities, to people having a voice in conversations, and to things that are profoundly affecting them and being supported and empowered. And that does seem to me like a really important starting point, both for narratives around solidarity, but also narratives around just transition sit very well with perhaps a conversation that we're already having as a society to some extent.
And from Paz, what do you think are the habits that we must promote in society to achieve a real solution to climate change? I personally believe that environmentalists have worked hard to promote recycling or energy efficiency, but the curve of the climate crisis does not change that way. Yes, that's an interesting question. I would perhaps give a slightly sideways answer to that, which is that I think part of what's important in as a response is the process of exchange across society, and the work we did on the Talking Climate Conversations work that we did last year showed how important it is that people have an exchange with each other. In other words, if you've been taken some kind of
cycling with the kids to school or whatever, that actually people start having conversations about that, because that's the way that social norms start to change, that people start to be aware that their peers are doing something different. But also we do see that evidence on low carbon behaviour change shows that people do tend to kind of fall back on these, you might say, kind of like smaller measures, turning lights off, recycling, and that's kind of what we've been trained to do. And actually, but if they shift into taking slightly more significant measures and perhaps more painful for themselves, choosing not to take a flight, for example, when that opportunity is available to us, changing their eating habits, there's a stronger relationship with that person's identity arises from that. They've made a real decision on the basis of their concerns, of the things of having the capacity to do that, and are therefore more likely essentially to talk to their peers about that, and then they start to shift into a slightly different position. So rather than kind of breaking it down into like, these are the more effective and these are less effective, I partly think it's about taking the steps that sits with our identity, that people will have conversations about, that will start to change that dynamic across society and show governments that there's social consent for really transformative change.
And from Chris, Chris had a quibble on the word efficacy. He said we need to give people things to do.
Yeah.
Work in UCL, we have found it much more effective to work with people to help them discover for themselves the things they can do. Not only because they're experts on that event if they initially don't realize it, but that they'll also own it, giving it a greater commitment for more action.
Completely agree with your quibble, very good point. And obviously it aligns with what I was saying about kind of essentially not having a one-way flow of information, but a two-way flow of information. And in work that we've done on just transition, for example, this came through really powerfully, that actually the most effective way of communicating with different communities who are affected by the low carbon transition is to find a way of having an exchange with each other, of actually the communities being in a position of genuine power, genuinely feeling that you can form a solution together. So completely agree with your quibble. I would edit that if I could. You're right. Good point.
Just to say, we've got 2 minutes left on the webinar, and we've got 48 questions to go through still. So if we're happy to keep carrying on, just let everybody know that we'll have a recording of this webinar available on our website. So if you need to go now, so you can catch up on that at a later date. But we'll carry on for another 5 or 10 minutes. Robin, is that okay?
Fine, yeah, of course.
So the next question then is, how will climate outreach be linking in with different health professional groups in reinforcing and conveying these key messages?
I think we have some conversations ongoing, and probably this is something that sits more with a colleague than me, and I haven't got a direct answer for it just yet. I think the principle of it makes a lot of sense, and it's something that we would really like to do. I can't present you, unfortunately, with a sort of definite plan that's definitely happening on this, partly because it's not my area.
From Tanike, in an age of strong polarization and silos, especially in the news media, do you have a recipe for reaching across the gaps? Or is it really quite hopeless to try, since one of these is the wrong tribe?
I definitely don't agree that it's hopeless, and I definitely don't have a recipe. I think the approaches that have made sense to us, I mean, actually the strongest learnings that I've had from this myself has been the work that we did last year on talking climate, on having one-to-one conversations with people about climate change, where we essentially gave people how to have good conversations in sort of conflict situations, and then sent them out to have conversations about climate change in the real world with uncles and people on the bus and your friends and all the rest of it, and then got them to feed back to us and thought about what are the most effective ways of having those conversations. And what came through from that so strongly was this understanding, but essentially focusing on listening to each other and focusing on finding the points of connection between each other, and respecting each other. So essentially focusing on finding what we have in common with each other, listening to each other, not focusing on those points of division. And I think actually for me, some of my experience of COVID-19 experiences has been, have had conversations I wouldn't have had otherwise, and it has illustrated how easy it is to get stuck in social media bubbles and assume that you can't have a chat with someone on the bus that has a very different political perspective to you. But of course, we know that we can, we're all human beings. And I think coming in with that approach is really is really important. We've done quite a lot of work in climate outreach, kind of exploring different identities, different communities. So for example, we did some work with communities who work in the oil industry in Alberta, and just kind of listen to them and listen to their response to the ideas around environmentalists. And you can hear how much of the kind of opposition comes from questions around identity. So for example, if your son works for the oil industry, then you have a really strong sense of community and identity with buying into that community and opposition to other communities. And I think finding what the common narratives we have as human beings, what the common values we share are, and whether we can listen to each other and have dialogue with each other, it's a long job, and perhaps it's a person by person job. And as I said, I haven't got a perfect recipe for it, but that's the approach that makes sense to me.
Next question is from Leah. Could it be difficult to entirely trust the scientists about climate change regarding the heavy history of doubt culture in this field? What do you think about that?
So again, I didn't quite understand the question.
So what Leah means is with trusting scientists, their scientists work a lot with uncertainty is what I think Leah is trying to mention. So the doubt culture in that we're always on a path to finding truth. We'll never have the facts. So how do we operate in communicating climate change in that field?
Yeah, we have done some work on this in the past on climate outreach. I think there's some briefings available and thinking about the different framings around uncertainty and risk. And one of the difficulties I think we have as climate communicators is the language that scientists are trained in really doesn't tend to work in the real world. So for example, when they're talking about uncertainty, what they essentially are talking about is the levels of risk, and that you have a 95 or 99% assurance that something is true, but you never become completely sure that it's true. But if we frame that uncertainty and talk about it in forms of risk, then that puts it in a language that makes more sense to us as individuals operating in the real world. And I think it's thinking about that kind of process of translation. And we've seen this with COVID-19 as well, this difficulty of taking kind of technical scientific information and converting it into something that will engage populations is always going to be a massive challenge. And there are many climate scientists now out there who are engaging amazingly with that challenge and really understanding it and finding new and interesting ways of communicating. So kind of feeding into that and understanding that to me that uncertainty is kind of exciting, because it shows that scientists are always seeking new forms, seeking the truth and narrowing down and never being so sure of themselves that they're not able to listen to new data, and that's good science. But finding ways of communicating that with society is a challenge that we all have to engage with.
From Lizzie, a communications challenge. British Airways is encouraging loyalty card holders to donate their air miles to NHS staff so they can have a free holiday as a thank you for being on the front line. It's hard to criticise NHS staff getting any form of reward, but air miles shouldn't be encouraged if we're going to tackle climate change. It'd be interesting to know how you'd get the messaging right around something like this.
That is an interesting communications challenge. I think it's important to listen, I think, to the guts of what's in there. So to understand, sort of come from a point of understanding what NHS workers or need and want, and perhaps even asking them questions about whether this is something that they're comfortable with. Because some of what we've seen arising from the data is that actually a lot of people that fly a lot for work, or for example, actually find it a slightly unpleasant experience. They might not necessarily have such a positive reaction to it as you might imagine. I think we have to be really, again, it's this question of like timing and taking care, being really careful about sort of how directly anything that's going to help the NHS is criticised. But I think ultimately there's a growing awareness in society of the damaging implications of this kind of fossil fuel based, and having some kind of confidence in that and speaking to that, I think is something that I would have confidence in.
Thank you, Robin. So we're coming to time. I'm thinking we take about 3 more questions and then we'll close it up as people are starting to close off now as well. Is that okay with you, Robin?
Of course, yeah.
So then for the 3 more, one from Angela. So is this UK only research that you presented? And are there global collective phrases that we could use, such as those listed as fair, preparedness, well-being, and continuity?
It's a really good question, partly, as I said, because a lot of climate engagement research has been undertaken in essentially a few developed countries. And so quite a lot of what we're drawing on, for example, in the data on flooding does come from the UK. A lot of the data that I drew on in terms of people's responses to disruption, for example, blackouts, came from North America. I mean, obviously a lot of what we're talking about is people's kind of fundamental responses, that psychological responses, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to vary across societies very widely, because they're about our responses, our fundamental responses. I think that the fairness is something that has been tested fairly widely on an international level, and is a really profound, is a statement that tends to work really well. And the other framings, the centre-right work, that did come more from a European framing, but there's nothing that I see right now that's essentially, we can be fairly confident that they work cross-culturally, but really we need to be doing the work in many different parts of the world to confirm that as essentially as definite as we can be right now.
How would you start a conversation with someone who doesn't believe climate change exists? There are members of my family who have this attitude, despite me studying climate change to a master's level and understanding its impacts.
Yeah, tough. I would listen to them. I know it's really, really hard. I mean, this is what came out. I feel like a bit of a broken record here, but this is what came out so powerfully from the Talking Climate work that we did last year. Like those members of your family are people that you care about in other contexts, who you probably share values with, who you have things in common with, who you have people that you both mutually love, and essentially powerful conversations about climate change have got as much as possible to start from that point. So where you, and particularly if you find that there is something that is really fundamental to what they care about, so you're having a conversation about what they care about, but which you know is going to be fundamentally affected by climate change, then you have that opportunity to start listening to them, to start asking them to tell their story, and to start bringing climate change into that. The flip side of that as well, that's come out really powerfully, and this is an exercise I'd recommend for anybody, is telling your own climate story. So essentially, if you ask somebody a few basic questions like, when did you start feeling worried about climate change? What did you do about it? What are you doing about it now? And you can talk for 3 or 4 minutes. People will often come out with really profound and interesting stuff. You could do it with a friend. And if you tell your story in that way, when you're speaking from the I and just telling your story to someone who cares about you, it's very difficult for them to negate that and to say that your experience that you've personally had is something that doesn't matter, or that they don't believe in. So if you speak in that process of kind of listening, respect, connection, finding what you have in common, telling your story and giving them the chance to tell their story, and then bit by bit working your way through that into the conversation, I do agree it can be a job of years, but that's the best advice I can give. Oh, and I would suggest have a look at the Talking Climate handbook, because it sounds like it might be of use to you.
It's linked in the chat. Final question from Ben then. Any advice about Second World War metaphors? After World War II, Europe rebuilt with US help from the Marshall Plan, and UK built the NHS. So people worked collectively for a new vision out of tragedy. How well does that kind of framing work in our current crisis?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think particularly living in the UK, and perhaps making an analogy to the climate visuals work I was talking about, when we showed people imagery of polar bears, melting ice, globes on fire, they went, oh yes, yeah, climate change, and it made that connection with them. They knew what it meant. They knew that it meant climate change. And again, when we, certainly in the UK, hear narratives about the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, we know what that means. Like, it sets off a sort of preloaded set of responses in us, because it's such a sort of crucial and core part of our history that we've been talking about since we were children. But there's a disadvantage to that, because it means that perhaps it might have less emotional power because of that fact, because it's kind of a preloaded but perhaps quite superficial in us. And I'll actually find particularly as you say, like the Marshall Plan, the creation of the NHS, they are really powerful stories. And they're really powerful parts of our history that are embedded us and a part of us. So that's the pro of doing it. I think the con is if they perhaps start to feel a little bit too much like cliches, and if we can find ways of having the same conversation where we don't use war as an analogy, partly because it's just something new. It just helps people to sort of come at it from a new story and a new direction and go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that example before. And I had that effect when I read about the Fukushima example of the Japanese government. It's like, I didn't know that before. That's really interesting, and it kind of teaches you a new lesson. So I say, yes, definitely they are powerful stories, but we also need to be finding new powerful stories that perhaps aren't quite so preloaded in our brains.
Can I give you just one more question? Because
yes,
linked really interesting to the presentation. Another one from Ben. Very interesting to hear your suggestion to test talking more about fragility than emergency.
Yeah.
Explain a bit more about why. Is that because people may relate more now to the fragility due to COVID?
Yeah. So there's some data that suggests that, as I said, like if we experience one, what they call like a dread risk, a sort of existential risk happening in our lives, and it also happens with people who have experienced health risks, we become kind of more sensitized to the idea that other bad stuff can happen, essentially, that other dread risks could arise. So I would suggest that as a society, our kind of sense of security and the sense that things are going to stay the same and we're probably all going to be fine and it's going to go on sort of pretty much as it is like now for a while, is somewhat disrupted at the moment. And therefore I don't want to sort of overstate it because it's kind of based on a few papers. The idea is that we might therefore be more sensitized to the idea that we're living in a fragile society. And though I haven't seen a lot of data on it, I've seen a bit of data, I certainly feel like I am seeing it reflected in the conversations that we're having in the UK. And that, because it's coming up in the conversations we're having in the UK, it's therefore like a powerful narrative to feed into. So that's why I made that suggestion. The climate emergency framing perhaps becoming less powerful, that came from the conclusion that people may well become less concerned about climate change, though to reiterate, that hasn't necessarily happened yet. Whereas fragility feels like it's a powerful conversation that's arising. So that's why I made that suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Robin. So we'll end the Q&A there, and really sorry we couldn't get through all the questions. It was a really popular webinar. Any final points that you want to make, Robin, before we close?
No, I'm all talked out, and but it's been really fascinating, and I'm really excited to see that there's still 166 people on the call. So I really hope, essentially, as I said at the beginning, this is in a sense a first attempt. You know, it's a first attempt to pull together the data, say this is where we think we're at, and us trying to be helpful, trying to provide something that we can to the community that people can use. So all your feedback and thoughts, reflections, criticisms are only going to be useful to us as we try and be more useful in the future. There you are. That's my ending.
Thank you, Robin. And just to remind everyone, we'll have this recording alongside our report, which is on our website, and that should be ready early next week. And when we end this webinar, you'll be directed to a survey. So we'd really appreciate it if you could also fill out a survey so we could keep delivering effective communications to you. And also when you're on our website, don't forget to sign up to our newsletter, because we'll be doing a lot more webinars like these in the near future. So thank you to everyone, and goodbye, Robin.
Thank you very much.
See you soon.
See you soon.